Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. I'm so glad today because I have my good friend Jason Harrigan here for the first time, actually joining me in a Zoom call, in a Zoom recording, and we will comment on Canto 22 of Paradiso together. Before we start, even for the people who maybe haven't don't know you or haven't seen your channel, Jason, on YouTube, would you mind giving a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and a great pleasure to be speaking to you. Yeah, my name is Jason. I'm based here in Ireland, live in Ireland, and like yourself, a reader, a Catholic, someone who has a deep understanding of my own sense of what faith and faith life is. And particularly, I think, for this canto, and thank you for having me on for this canto, someone who has spent decades now trying to understand the contemplative and indeed live a contemplative kind of life. So I have a booktube channel where I talk about all kinds of books, and my tastes are very eclectic, but in the background there's always my religious reading and spiritual reading. And I'm a big fan of silence and retreats, and that coming to know oneself that a contemplative life likes to offer. So yeah, that's why Canto 22 really speaks to me. I leave the nasty Roman emperors to Steve, who you had on for Trajan.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you. Thanks so much for being part of this huge project that started more than a year ago, and we are getting close to the end. And a little bit like Dante, because Dante is feeling in this canto that he's getting close to the end. And so there will be this wonderful moment when he turns back and looks down. Canto 22 is just a gem, it's just a diamond, because they sometimes come in couples or pairs, Dante's cantos, and this is a pair together with Canto 21. They more or less address similar topics. And obviously we are in the seventh heaven. Just to give a little bit of context, we are in the seventh heaven, the heaven of Saturn, which is the last one of the, let's say, heavens that are inhabited by souls of men, of historic men who actually, and people who lived in history. So knowing about your passion and your predilection for the contemplatives and all the readings that you've done about just the monks' lives and in your experience, I don't know anybody in my life who would be more perfect to discuss about this canto than Jason Harrigan. So I'm so happy to have you here.
Well, I know a few monks who would be better, but they're not here right now.
We'll try to call them for maybe another call towards the end. So in terms of understanding the canto, knowing that the context is the seventh heaven, Dante keeps ascending with Beatrice, and in the previous one he has encountered the vision of the golden ladder. And maybe we can start from there, actually, because I know a little bit about the fact that the golden ladder is a symbol that is found in so many different cultures and so many different histories. I think from the Celts to the, Iraqi Mesopotamians, and this symbol of this stair or ladder has always meant, you go one step after a step after a step, and you elevate yourself towards, could we say asceticism or a contemplative life?
Contemplative. There's a very long tradition in contemplative practice, particularly within a monastic setting. It's often known, you think of Guido of the Carthusians has wrote extensively on using the imagery of a ladder and then identifying each rung as a step on the way of first kind of divesting yourself of yourself, then finding who your true self is before you can ascend to approach the divine. the goal of a contemplative life is to, in my opinion, to come under the gaze of God, to come into the presence, into the light of God. And the ladder shows in a very clear way, of course, Jacob's ladder being the kind of prototype in the Christian tradition, it shows that this is a series of actually defined steps that are there to be followed. And there's things we need to understand and master as individuals before we can move up those rungs. A ladder isn't an escalator. It involves physical activity. It involves action to
great point.
ascend or descend. It isn't an automatic path. So it takes work on behalf of the person approaching it. And these are then things that in the contemplative life, these are things like that Saint Benedict tells us in the rule, that John Cassian wrote about, that Benedict drew on for his rule, or the rule of the master, which was an earlier rule, about 30, 40 years before Benedict wrote his rule, which was just slightly longer. But what Benedict does in that rule is even he sets out himself processes that monks should try to go through. And these are ascetic practices, and in the main, these are things like practicing humility, temperance, practicing good acts and virtue. And it's important for this canto because I think it is that transition. We're moving beyond, like I say, Saturn now. We're ready to move into the kind of higher realms of heaven. And there's this reconciliation going on, I think, between the natural cosmology that has come beforehand, the cosmology of man and history, and now we're moving into divine realms, those higher realms. And really, if you think of even the heavens to be risen through as rungs on the ladder, there's this journey and this understanding that Dante has learned for himself and has shared with us, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the road to heaven is paved with good intentions. But it's our failings as humans that cause the rungs to break. And we have a blueprint. It isn't, no pun intended, it isn't rocket science on how to get there, but we constantly sabotage ourselves as humans, and that's our frailty as humans. And I think at the end of the previous canto, where Father Peter Damien, makes his appearance and kind of warns against going too far into the ascetic lifestyle. This is the guy who brought the disciplina, who brought the knotted cord into popular use as an ascetic practice. Self-flagellation, mortification of the flesh, and these are all valid practices. But like everything, and I think particularly now that we're in Saturn, a word to remember is temperance, is moderation. That doing something really severe or ascetic just for the sake of it can become a fetish in of itself, if you like, and you lose sight of what it is you're trying to get towards. So the ladder, I think, is just a really good visual clue. It's a really good mental image for people to contemplate on, that contemplation side of a contemplative life, which is not meditation, which is not just prayer. It's kind of a stage beyond those kind of processes,
Wow, there will be so much to say, about these topics, and I am myself trying to squeeze out something out of this canto, but it's one of those cantos that you just can keep reading and rereading and still find different angles. And for example, what you mentioned about our human fragility and our inability to just move forward without making this effort. There is a history within the history of Christianity of a constant renewal, right? A constant renewal, and this is where Dante, this is where we can see Dante as a moralizer, one of the many, somebody who looks at his reality, his contemporary reality, and notices that is not up to par, is not it doesn't cut it, which is almost like a constant state of being for Christianity, the fact that we've never, Christianity has never reached in its history a point where everybody was doing exactly the right thing. In fact,
Yeah.
it's quite the contrary. And so Dante looks around, and Pier Damien in the previous canto has something negative to say about the behavior of the clergy, of some monks. Yes. And this is what spurs this huge scream, or yeah, it's a scream that he hears in the heaven, and he is terrified immediately. And this is how the canto starts, with Dante's terror. And then Beatrice reassures him. He says, hey, we are in heaven, so don't worry, whatever happens has a reason. And many scholars think that Dante throws a little bit of a dagger at Boniface VIII here at the beginning of the canto, where at verse 15, Beatrice tells him, if you really understand what's going on, you would understand that this type of wrath of God towards the unworthy clergy will actually happen in the right way. He's probably referring to Boniface VIII, whom obviously he hated, and what happened to him with the problems that had happened. So, and in this context, I think enters Benedict. Saint Benedict is yet another one of these people who, throughout Christianity, were so pivotal and crucial that you almost wonder, what would Christianity have been without him? He was really one of the pillars of this history.
Yeah. It's interesting that Benedict appears when he does. It's also interesting that he doesn't appear, just his soul appears, because Dante asks to see him and he says, no, not yet. We must be obedient. You must wait till you're ready to be revealed, and shows a bit of humility as well, I think, of Benedict, saying where he could reveal himself, but no, it's not about me, it's about what I'm about to tell you. And he says, I'm not quoting exactly, I was reading it in Terzarai, this particular translation.
Oh, excellent.
It's easy to read, but it's not very purist. But that, the parchment that he wrote the rule on has become worthless. And you're kind of talking about this corruption that's there, that's very visible within the church. And it's interesting you mentioned, the reforms that are going on, and that Dante himself is thinking that, indeed in his own life thought some kind of reforming needed to be done. I tend to think of it in the context of Benedict as well, as a return to the simplicity of the message, to strip away. One of the aspects of a contemplative life is the wholeness of the experience. It's not a life that concerns itself purely with theology or with dogma or with doctrine. It tries to encapsulate the whole. It has an entire cosmology in of itself. And I think what Benedict is calling for is a return. This is 800 years since Benedict wrote his rule when Dante is writing. And here I am today in 2022 with my little copy of the rule that I try to apply as a married man living on the west coast of Ireland, So there's great value in this tiny little work, because everything that's extraneous is stripped away. It's to prefer nothing
back to
else.
The basics.
Yeah, to prefer nothing else and to put nothing else before God. That is the goal of people who want to be saintly, which is what Benedict was encouraging his monks to be. And that means not getting mired down in the politics of the curia or the clergy, not getting mired in the culture wars, which are called now, but even then existed within the church between different regions and areas, that there's no progress in those ways. And Benedict is saying we need to reform, but his form of reform is to return to those basics. Look at my rule that I wrote. It's still going. And it is it is a blueprint that's there, you know. And he talks about, he mentions Peter, and he says, look, Peter established the church with no silver or gold.
No silver and gold. That's so beautiful.
No silver and gold. And he built this church. But look at the church now. It is obsessed in Dante's time, and you could argue now to a certain extent.
Exactly.
There's an unhealthy accumulation of wealth. The means for it being accumulated may be just, you know, down to how long the church is around, but still it's there. The Vatican Bank periodically gets mired in controversy, etc.
Yeah.
And Benedict then says, look at Benedict. He went the route of prayer, the divine office, this routine every day of praying, you know, which is something I do, you know, get up in the morning and have lauds, and you have your periods during the day, and these are short. You have terce and non and sext and vespers in the evening, you know, compline at night. And it's this universality of prayer rising up to the heaven almost all day long, and fasting. And then he brings in St. Francis, of course, to drive home the message of the mendicants, of poverty, of humility. And these critiques that Dante made of the church are valid critiques today.
Yeah.
And became critiques that were leveled at the church almost from its very earliest days. But he's saying, if we look back to the original, look to Peter, look to what I wrote, look to Francis, look to these souls that we're encountering up in this upper levels of heaven, where we're leaving. There's this reconciliation between the kind of history, the human history that's led to this point, this constant looking back at the failure of humanity, of all these different despots we've met and these different figures from history who have corrupted not only their lives, but the lives of everybody around them. And Benedict is saying, look, you're approaching, here's the ladder, you're approaching, you know, you're heading for the Imperium.
Yeah.
Now is the time for purity. Now is the time to look to the sources, look to the origins, and be faithful to those origins. And don't get distracted, because there's that wonderful scene at the end where Beatrice says, look back, look how far we've come. And he looks down and he sees through, you know, like that great photograph that was taken of Earth in space. He sees Earth.
That's right, exactly.
But not as kind of a perfect, not as a yearning, but he sees the failings of humanity, but he sees them in perspective. They are things that can be overcome. They are frailties and weaknesses that we can work and fix by following the example of Peter, Francis, Benedict, Damien. It's very interesting.
That particular scene is one of the most powerful, in my opinion, of the entire comedy. Dante and Beatrice turning back for the first time since they have started their ascent into paradise, turning back and looking down at little Earth. This as a little maybe piece of trivia, I was researching a little bit, and I learned, because I didn't know, that this particular idea was probably sourced by Dante by writing of Cicero, where he's in his De Republica, he wrote the dream of Scipio the African, where Scipio as well dreamt about going up in space in the universe and turning back and seeing the Earth from far away and reflecting upon, almost with the same type of benevolent sense of commotion that Dante has when he smiles back at the smallness of Earth in the immensity of creation.
Yeah.
And, you know, while you were speaking, something that jumped to my mind is, where is Virgil? You know, because
where is Virgil?
Because that's one of the important things. I mean, you know, he's one of the main characters of the Divine Comedy, and by this point, we have left Virgil so far behind.
Yeah.
And especially I'm hit by the meaning of this, the meaning of the fact that Virgil, representing reason and rationality, At this point, we are so near to God that, yes, rationality, we know that is important. But at this point, as we are really thinking about the contemplatives and almost a mystic experience that Dante will have at the very end of Paradiso, reason has very little to do with the forces that are in play. And so maybe one question that I have, because I still haven't completely figured out in my mind, is we talk about active saints, and Saint Francis maybe represents that, Saint Dominic represents that, but then Saint Benedict and the contemplatives are not active. They are more prayerful, and they're more focused on the being. And so my question is, I remember an Italian monk telling me his own story many years ago, and telling me that when he decided to become a monk, his father, who was not really Catholic, he asked him, so what are you going to do, right, as a monk? And he said to his father, I'm not really going to do
not going to do anything. Yeah.
It's more about a being than doing. And so I don't know if I have completely understood this concept, and I would kind of turn the question to you with your...
It is there. You hear many times even monks themselves talk about a wasted life. Of course, they're being a bit ironic when they talk about it in their memoirs, for example, or Michael Casey, a Benedictine monk, an Australian Benedictine monk, makes like an unexciting life, you know, that's what it is. And I think at this point, before, it's interesting what you say about, you know, the mystical kind of experience and the divine experience, and this is a kind of a nub of the contemplative experience. And we're at this transition, like I say, in Dante's journey to the fixed stars. And this reconciliation has to occur between the kind of human, natural, normal side of living and experience of life, and then the supernatural, divine side of living. And these have to be reconciled to move forward. And of course, if we look back at all the failings that have been mentioned to date and all the shortcomings, it's easy to understand that this is actually the hardest task.
Right.
The goal of the contemplative is to, like I say, from my point of view, is to come into the gaze of God, to come into the light of God, just to be present in it. Okay. We had that at the start of Canto 21. I can't think of the legend now, with Jupiter and was it Sephone?
Selene.
Selene,
yes.
where when she was exposed to the full kind of divinity of Jupiter's existence, it was too much for her to bear.
Yeah.
This is the warning tale for the contemplative. This is the warning tale to say, if you want to ascend that ladder, a contemplative ladder, and approach the gaze of God, you need to prepare yourself to be filled with this divine light. And the crying out, the kind of the tremendous noise that opens this particular canto, this kind of screaming, thunderous screaming, it's almost like a warning as well that, you know, not so much that the wrath of God will fall. I know that's part of it, that Damien is saying, you know, the vengeance of God and the wrath of God. But of course, this wrath comes from God's love. It doesn't come from any kind of hatred or malice. You know, he loves to love and hates when he sees it being misused or abused, which is where I think this comes from. I think that's simple enough without going too deep into, you know, a wrathful God or a vengeful God, because you can get sidetracked by the Old Testament. Yes. We're not going there in this video. But the job of the contemplative is to understand their own life. The earliest monastic contemplatives, the earliest hermits, they went to the desert. They followed the lead of Jesus. They went to the desert, not to find God initially, but to find themselves, because a contemplative has to find themselves first. And this is what the meditation, the silence, the retreat, the escaping away from everyday life. And it's to escape the intrusions of everyday life. It's to be able to find the space to first understand yourself and accept yourself before you can even think about understanding and accepting God. If you want to approach him that closely, you know what I mean? And I think that's why at this point I see it very much as that transition kind of cantos, that a contemplative, you know, you go to your cell as a monk, yes, to find God, but what you find first and have to deal with first is yourself. I've said it, I've been on silent retreats, some of them quite extended silent retreats, and it can become very uncomfortable to live with yourself and not have the distractions of the phone or even books necessarily, certainly not fiction or television or other people to speak to. Because you don't have the opportunity to tell stories about yourself that aren't true. You won't tell yourself stories about yourself that aren't true. You'll tell your true story to yourself. And with that telling of that story comes acceptance. And I think that's what dims the light of ego, if you like. That's what dims the light of our kind of non-humble personality. That allows the space for the divine light to enter and not crush us and not feel like wrath or not feel overwhelming. Awe-inspiring, yes. There's moments I have felt of approaching awe in the true sense of its meaning, but not overwhelming, and certainly not something that will cause any kind of harm. But I think the contemplative route is that first finding an understanding of self and accepting self. If that makes sense.
It does. It's just it just sounds difficult, you know. The more I think, the more you understand what it is that really the contemplative life is about, the more you understand it, the more I understand it, the more it sounds difficult. And but it's possible. It's something that we as human beings can
absolutely, yeah. This is why I said a ladder and not an escalator. You've got to work at it, and of course this is where things like Benedict talks about in his rule, the idea of discipline, the idea of humility, the idea of asceticism, ascetic practices, to forego things that on one level are maybe very comfortable, but on another level are distractions. On another level are things that are keeping us from feeling the pain of our own existence. You know, and I think really, as a contemplative, it's one of the functions of it is to understand your own existence and understand self. And that can be very, very uncomfortable, I believe, for everyone who tries to do it. I don't think it's a straight ship, a straight kind of comfortable sailing. But like anything in life that's worth doing, it's never easy, you know. And much like Dante, it's a journey. It's a journey through your failings. It's a journey through all the people that have let you down, that you have let down. You know, there's I see a lot of similarities when I think about it. But I do think it is key. It's very instructive that now is when the contemplatives enter into his journey. It's very instructive that now he is getting, like I said, the kind of source material of the Gospels. How to live your life. What was the message that God wanted to give us? You know, love one another as I have loved you. Practice humility. You know, the meek shall inherit the earth. You know, it's the poor that Jesus hung around with. It wasn't the kind of politicians. It wasn't the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and you know. And I think in the contemplative model of people, we get church leaders who are humble. They're not corporate CEOs. And I think sometimes today I look at some of the cardinals and some of the politics that go on, and I go, they've morphed into a kind of modern sensibility of what leadership is. But I think the examples of Peter and Benedict and Francis are that they're examples of pure leadership, and this is why they're all saints and fathers of the church, because they're so important to keeping the focus on what it should be.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating is that when we really strip it down, like you say, when we go back to the basics, which is what the greatest saints have been trying to do.
Yeah.
There is, at the end, a certain red line that really unites people and human beings even outside of Christianity. This fighting the ego, this trying to strip down, obviously with all the modifications that we have to do, because every religion has its own framework of reference. But we hear a lot of this in even myself, that I'm really ignorant about any Oriental philosophy and religion, but we hear a lot of this basic concept of the combating the ego, combating the self, and making room inside for something much bigger, the immensity of the divine, etc. Like you were saying, this is effort. It takes effort and it takes time. This is probably the main reason why the Divine Comedy could not be a 120 pages book, because
yeah. I mean, it takes an effort to read and understand the Divine Comedy. I mean, what a masterclass of erudition, of philosophy, of classical thought, and now the contemplatives wouldn't have had a huge truck with philosophy. They weren't too bothered with philosophy because, again, that would have been seen particularly as a distraction. It's an abstraction from what you wanted to be doing. But I think there's a universal truth, to use that kind of hackneyed phrase, across a broad, if not the entire spectrum of religious experiences that have been around in humanity, predating Christianity, post-dating Christianity, right up to contemporary ones. And there is, in the Western world, we seem to have imported this kind of Eastern idea as well of, Zen, finding oneself and contemplation. That's a different kind of contemplation than a contemplative life in a Catholic or Christian context, for sure. But certainly, nature abhors a vacuum. So we fill ourselves with the detritus of life, with our accumulated experiences.
Oh yeah.
We carry around, but we carry around, that old phrase, like the baggage. And the truth is, if we don't deal with it, if we don't take time to tease things out and to accept them and to move past them or deal with them once and for all, they stay and they become one more step on the road to Calvary. They become one more thing to carry around. And I think, for me, a contemplative kind of practice allows the space to just get rid of that stuff and to recognize, as Dante looks back down on earth, to recognize maybe sometimes the beauty of self, yes, but also its insignificance in the light of the divine. We're all beautiful individuals. I don't want to be airy-fairy, but we're all God's children, if that's what I would think. So we're all made by God. There's no mistakes. Our quirks and differences are our own. That's how we're made. But when Dante looks back and he sees the earth, I think he's seen himself too. He has that wonderful phrase where he remembers with nostalgia the Tuscan breath, the Tuscan air.
Oh yeah, and the olive oil.
Yeah, and the olive oil. But he talks about that Tuscan breath, and I think that's a hark back to that original, to that breath of life breathed into. That at the very outset there was a divinity that was within, with that Tuscan air that he took his first screaming lung.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And that divinity was there. But from that moment to where he is now, that's been piled and suppressed, and all the things that have happened to him, the exile, have been weighed down and pushed on him. And in that moment of clarity, before he ascends into the fixed heavens, he looks back and he remembers those things. The olive oil, like you say, the mother's milk of Italy. Yeah, and it is an active life. The act, you know, a contemplative life is a life of action, but it's an interior action for both an interior and exterior result. You know, it's not kind of navel gazing for the sake of it. It has a very.
I'd love you to expand a little bit on this. You know, I'd love to, for myself also, to understand when you say both interior and exterior goal. Could you please expand a little bit on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think from the interior point of view, it's that interior life, like I said, about the self, and if you like, understanding who you are and being unafraid to be completely honest with yourself of who you are. All the good stuff, all the great stuff that I love about Jason, and all the terrible stuff, all the weaknesses and the failings and the bad things I've done and the bad thoughts I've had, etc., etc. And it's been able to reconcile those things and accept them and change them. This is the exteriority of it then. So it's not just an exercise in thinking, I'm centered and I'm great and I'm at one with myself and the universe as well. Like I said about the prayer, even the divine office, this idea, like I get up sometimes to do the night office at the times the Carthusians would be doing it, you know, 12:30, 2 a.m. And I join in with my own kind of breviary and stuff like that. And I just love that idea of this prayer rising up for all humanity, for everyone, for all there is. And people can debate whether prayer is valuable or not, but if it's done with the intent that it is valuable, if it's done with the intent of authenticity and done from a place of humility, I think it is. And this is an external thing, but more than that, contemplatives can have served and do serve as guideposts to us when we get lost, and to the greater church, that when we get lost along the way, we can look at the people who are staying the path, who are climbing the ladder, who have not deviated from that original thing. And this is an exterior example of the church. I saw in your previous video I watched, you were talking about Cardinal Robert Serra, who is a big fan of the Carthusians and the contemplative orders, as are many of the recent popes have spoken, from John Paul II right up to the popes, now Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, have spoken about the importance of the contemplative orders to the church, that they are the root. The Carthusians have a saying that, you know, the cross stands still while the world rotates. You know, and I think this is their exterior thing, done quietly, done with humility, with no fanfare, with no looking for adulation. And I think this is really important lesson, but we have to be prepared to recognize it and understand it. And we have to be prepared to accept it. And this is the interior struggle as an individual. Very hard to do as a lay person who deals with the real world. I've got, you know, a wife, I've got kids, work, house, mortgage, cleaning, I have to cut the grass, you know. I don't spend all my days, but what I do is I try to carve out time every day and have that structure. One of the great kind of unofficial sayings of the rule of Saint Benedict is ora et labora, you know, prayer and work. And a contemplative life forces you to find the balance, where your focus is not just on worldly ends, like making a living. It's not just on enjoyment and entertainment. And these are all important things if you live in a community that you need this to function. You're not living in a cave in Subiaco, you know. But you still should make the effort to carve out time. And I expound this to people who are not Catholic or have no faith or anything else, that I think it's important to to take those little times every day. And I'm not talking about meditation. If that's what works for you, fine. I have no objection to any particular type of thing people do, you know. But I do think it's very beneficial. And I think following a model of a contemplative life allows me to put a lot of things in perspective, because it's very easy to lose that perspective, like Dante done climbing, ascending the heavens. And again, at this transitional canto, this really important canto, I think, it's that chance to reflect and look back and put things in perspective. Like I say, it's a beautiful image, actually, you know, and it's where Dante is about to leave humanity, essentially, and enter into the world of the supernatural, of the divine. Yeah, and perspective is so important for that, you know.
Yeah, I was really struck, and I've always been struck by this tercet on verse 151, where Dante uses the metaphor of a garden. In Italian is aiuola, a garden that makes us so fierce. And so he says the earth is a garden that makes us really fierce. And it's making me think of what you were mentioning about the difference between a pure contemplative life, the life of a monk, and our layman life, where we try to follow that example as much as we can. But the external value of the contemplative life is to be exactly there, like you said, the kind of rock in the sea, the cross in the center of the world, and they represent that with their work, with their inner work, with their spiritual and contemplative work. They represent something that we all can strive to, we all can potentially achieve. If they didn't exist, we could be going around our lives saying, well, you know what, it's impossible, you know, because we're all just, but we have those examples. We have those.
In many ways, they represent the rock that Peter built on. You know, in many ways, they are the foundation and continue to be the foundation. And they don't like to reform. They don't like to change. They like to ignore the modern world as much as possible and say, you know, just because the world has changed doesn't mean we have to change the way we practice our belief. It doesn't mean we have to change the way we pray, how we live our lives. We don't have to be connected like we are now across oceans and time zones, thanks to technology. And all these things are beneficial. But let's be honest, they're also just one more thing to deal with. You know, I didn't grow up with mobile phones. Now in the morning when I've done my stuff, I have to check my phone to see if messages have come through. I have to check my emails. And it's just one more thing to do every day.
They are not necessary. They're not necessary.
Technology promises all these shortcuts, but really it doesn't. It just gives us more tasks to do every day. And I, as you know, you probably know, like at Lent times, I move away from, like, don't follow my YouTube to watch lots of videos, because I don't make a lot, but I take all of Lent off, more or less, off YouTube and mobile phones and Instagram and all these things that I enjoy, because it's important to be able to disconnect. And that gives me that perspective on it. I find I don't miss it. My life, you know, my life carries on. The sun rises, I get up, and the day happens.
And maybe, perhaps, there's never been a time where this has been more relevant, because you know, we as a society, coming out of 2 years of madness with the not only COVID, which was a madness, but also the media influence about it, because sometimes that's even worse, the influence of media in our brain, and that ability to, we have the possibility, it's just that we don't do it very well, to detach, to take that one breath, and like you say, the encouragements to do it are never enough. Even I would have said at the church this morning, our priest reminded everybody to take a breath, because there are so many different things that keep hitting us, and we cannot, our attention is very precious, is very, very precious, because it's connected to our soul. And that's literally wasting our life if we pay attention to all these type of distractions, versus the monk that as a joke you can say, oh, they're wasting their life, but in fact they're doing the opposite.
They're following the rule of Benedict, because Benedict says very clear in his rule to prefer nothing else before God. So his rule, it's very simple. It's why the rule is so thin. He's saying this is just what you do, and then he talks about how to run a monastery and the best way to allow this to happen. You know, only do enough work to satisfy your modest tastes and means, etc., etc. But when I think the danger is when we, if and I'm very conscious, and people listen to this won't all be like Catholics or Christians, or whatever. But speaking for myself, when I move away from putting that goal first, there's lots of things to fill it. There's no shortage of things that become priority number one. I'm a big fan of to-do lists, but often I waste too much time writing the lists.
Doing the to-do list.
I'm doing and not doing, you know. And I think the thing about a contemplative life, a monastic life, an enclosed life, is that these men and women are doing it. They're doing it. They're doing the thing they said they would do. And they're doing it without being distracted by all the worldly things that could distract them. And there's something very admirable about that, whether you believe what they're doing is right or matters or is important. Yeah. I find personally something hugely, I'm filled with awe and admiration for people. My mother used to always say, you know, you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? Huh. You know, and I admire anyone who can walk the walk. We can all talk a good fight, but will we stand up when it's time to be counted, you know? And this is where I think I daily have to remind myself to try and make that time, or I'll end up just talking about it and stop doing it. Same and I see lots of people who talk about it.
Yes.
But I see less and less people doing it.
Because it's so much easier. It's so much easier.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a big focus on, when it comes to contemplation today, especially, there's a big focus on science, biology, and everything that does not sound scientific by our secular world tends to be dismissed a little bit, no?
Yeah.
And so, however, as a Christian, as a Catholic, I always have the science in the back of my mind, even if it's not in front of my mind, in the back of my mind, I have it. And I realize that when you talk about a contemplative, making work, doing effort, there is actually a biological burning of calories in living the contemplative life. It happens in our brain. Inside our brain, there are things that our science of today cannot explain yet, but they actually do happen, and they take effort, they take a certain power to I think some people are starting to analyze and to maybe look into that. We probably never get to the bottom of it, of course, but it is happening. We're not talking about fluff, you know, we're actually talking about things that actually happen.
Yeah, I've never had a huge problem reconciling science and faith. I think a lot is made of people who want to make it something that's more important than it is to people of faith. Kind of like almost like a gotcha, you know, but how do you explain this? And I go, I'm not offering an explanation for anything. This is both the weakness and the beauty of faith, is that I'm not here to explain my faith to anyone. That's my faith. You know, it's you know, unless you really want to know, it's probably not going to be very interesting for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But again, I think to pull it back to the canto, like I say, we're moving into the fixed heavens. We're moving from the natural world that we're gradually understanding more and more of. But we'd be kind of foolish to think we understand it all yet. And every time we've made kind of definitive, declarative statements over the centuries, they have to be kind of walked back a little bit or tuned. And of course, this is science, this is progress. It's about getting deeper and deeper to truths. And of course, we're not at any kind of universal truths yet.
Absolutely.
But I think this movement shows us is that Dante is expressing the very real belief that was a medieval belief, that was a belief back from the earliest church fathers, and I believe is a belief today that there's just something more, that faith brings that something more, that added dimension to our lives beyond the basic biology or chemistry or physics. And I'm not talking about hoodoo, voodoo, magic. As you know, I have an interest in the history of the occult, but what I'm interested in is what people believed, why they believed it. And these are all just different ways of explaining the unknowable.
Yeah.
These are just different approaches to explaining the unknowable. And you know, for a long time, magic was the top of that pile. For a long time, religion was the top of that pile. Now, at the moment, science is the top of that pile, but they overlap. They're like a Venn diagram.
They all do.
Yeah, and it's where they overlap, I find, is where the interesting intersections are, and where there's interesting things being done. But I'm no scientist. I love science. I think it's incredible. Our own Vatican is a huge promoter of science and astronomy, discovery. There's no denial about big bangs or any of that kind of stuff coming from the Vatican. You won't hear that as much as people try to tell me, oh, but you believed it was made in the 7 days in the blink of an eye. I did when I was 5, and that's how the world was explained to me as a 5-year-old. But as a 52-year-old who's lived a little bit, maybe I'm ready to understand at a deeper level. So maybe don't quote me Genesis and say you believe every word of this literally. You know, parables and storytelling have always been a way of imparting information, and this is what Dante is doing in the Divine Comedy. He is imparting useful, intelligent information wrapped up in a wonderful story. The first real travel narrative. It's like a travel journal.
Yeah.
From A to Z, and he's filled it with these fantastical stories. Do we take them at face value? Not always, but do we learn from them and be fascinated by them and try to understand what exactly is being said? Of course. And this is the same way I approach the Bible, you know. So science and everything has its place, but I do think there is a digression. In a faith life, in a contemplative life, there is a parting of the ways. There is a 7th heaven that you reach, and that's as far as your humanity can bring you on the ladder. And then you have to make that next step
maybe
to the divine.
And maybe what should be a great comfort to all of us, believers or not, is that these truths that you're referring to, that Dante is referring to, it doesn't matter whether we know them and how we know them or not. They're still there. They're still there.
They're just there.
In this moment, you know, they're available. They are achievable by each one of us, and that's extremely powerful. You know, Dante feels very deeply when he talks about these topics. He is moved, and he always recenters himself in his sense of love, in the first love that from which all of the other love originated from him, which is Beatrice, is, you know, falling in love. And I think is one of the best conclusions of the different cantos of the Divine Comedy, where he says, in the end, I turn my eyes back to the beautiful eyes. You know,
that's it.
That's kind of his personal touch. Of course, it doesn't have any theological hidden meaning, but
it's just romance.
Yes.
It's medieval romance at its purest and finest, and I think that romance, if you can find that in your life is going to be much richer. Of course, I think you and I both share
Yes.
that. Share that with
we
our
are
partners.
blessed with that. We are blessed with
We've
that.
spoken about that, but again, it's that focus on what's important and that connection. I like to bring it back to the canto. I like when he's looking back and he's looking at these familial relationships between the systems. Jupiter was begat by, etc., etc. And really, I like to think of it like that. He's tying it back into the importance of that relationship with Beatrice to him that made him feel human, but also the relationship with the Abba, with the Father, with the Creator, that the Pan-Creator that he would have been familiar with from the mosaics of Ravenna, the kind of Byzantine icons of the Pantocreator over all the universe.
Yes.
That he's reflecting on the fact that all these things are familial, and sitting at the top is this ultimate relationship. And his most human expression of that is his love for Beatrice, and being like that lover's gaze in his eyes. And now she is taking him and saying, now we can push on and we can experience that divine gaze, to be in the presence of our Creator, if you like, which is the greatest love of all. And this is the journey that has taken us here. That's how I see it anyway.
Oh yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel like it doesn't matter, but what specific cultural context you're looking into. But when it comes to faith and religious systems, if you see the highest peaks, meaning the saints for Christianity, or I don't know what the equivalent is, for people who work really hard to put it in practice, like you say, instead of just talking the talk, they walk the walk and they do it, properly do it every day of their life, and they reach something. That something is the best that a human being can be. Yeah. That's really the best that a human being can be. That's why I really, really love the image of the contemplative. Even if there was just one monk left in the entire world, it would still be the little rock that helps us remember what we can be, what we can do.
This is it. It's that signpost. It's that rock to return to. And I think for anyone who pursues any level of contemplative life, after a period of time making it a kind of a practice, you kind of can't imagine living without it. It doesn't become second nature, because it isn't our second nature, it's our first nature.
Huh.
I think it's our first nature. And I think the ability to take out a lot of the kind of distractions and pain that builds up and all those various things in our lives that we hang on to, when we take those out, we fill it with goodness, because it's intentional. We're filling it with intent, not by accident, not by distraction, not just because it happened. You need to move past that as a contemplative, because this happened to me, I'm that, or because this was done and that. You have to park that stuff and jettison it. And then what do you do with that space you find in your life? You aim to climb the ladder and fill it with that divine light, with that shaft of light that's in the kind of distance that you're walking towards. And I think this is what Dante has spent a long time in these cantos, taking us to this point and saying, look at all the failings, look at humanity, but yet here still we can get to. I can still get to this point, to the foot of this ladder, and I have all the tools I need to climb it. Yeah.
It's I still feel, despite this being a wonderful conversation, I still feel that for myself, there is more that I need to understand. There is more that I need to properly, let's say, take in, I'm realizing that, and this is also why I appreciate so much you joining, this canto conversation. I realize that the closer we get to Canto 33 of Paradiso, the less I'm going to be able to keep up with Dante and actually get what he's saying.
I lack the language, Tom, to fully explain to you what I'm trying to say. I lack the vocabulary to do it. You'll just have to come to Ireland, and we'll go into my monasteries for a month, just me, you, and Dante, and our wives can visit every Sunday for 1 hour. That's it, no more. I'll show you a contemplative life rather than explain. It's something you need to see. Reading about it is fine. Talking about it is good. Doing it is best.
It's very different. It's very different. Oh yes. Oh yes. Well, my friend, I really, really appreciate your time, and for the little that it is, I hope that we helped people who are watching shed a little bit of light and rays of light on this. Another incredible canto. It's Canto 22.
It's an incredible canto, and I am a huge admirer of the work you have put in, because I understand the level of work you have put into this series. It isn't just turning on the camera and talking. For this canto, I done a lot of research over the last week or two, and it's never ending. We could do 10 videos just on this canto.
But it's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah,
I feel
it's a fantastic series. It's a credit to you. I have never had the ability to make anything of that kind of quality for BookTube. I'm happy just to ramble on about the odd book I read, but it's great fun. I enjoy it.
Really great to combine forces. Thanks so much again.
We'll have to do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason.
Ciao, Tom.